Love was not expensive. It definitely was not expensive. It was accessible, it was manageable, it was simple, it was fun. Yeah, it had its fair share of hardship, obviously. You know, I mean, it was South Africa before 1994. But on the whole, there was just this sense of things are possible. There was just the sense of things are doable. There was just the sense of it's okay to be a child in the city.
Sibongile Khumalo, musician, mother and child of Johannesburg. For more than half a century, she has called this city home.
Born in Orlando West, Soweto, some 50 plus years ago, at a time of very interesting changes, educational changes, political changes, strife, stress, repression. Yet my memories of Soweto are particularly pleasant. My memories of Soweto in particular bring back the greatness of communities that work together, communities that support each other.
It's the biggest and richest city in Africa. It endured war and struggled through the peace. Its identity changing with every decade, but to this day, the origins of its name remain a mystery. For some, it means wealth and success. For others, poverty and struggle. So whether you call it Joburg, Jozi, or simply Johannesburg, this is the city of gold.
I wasn't born in Johannesburg, but I grew up in Johannesburg from the age of 2. So for me, Joburg is part of me, and I must say whenever I travel abroad and you come back, then you know actually how special Johannesburg is. Because it is still today this very mix of things. It's not just one thing, it's a mix of things.
Johannesburg was built on gold. It was a mining camp that grew in a very haphazard way into a city. Paul Kruger, then President of South Africa, is said to have disregarded the early rumors of gold, fearing an influx of people, as it had been the case in cities where gold had been discovered before.
There were 2 brothers called Fred and Harry Struben, and there was a farmer called Lou Geldenhuys who owned the farm Wilgespreid, and he suspected that there was gold on his farm as well. And he invited Fred Struben to come and do prospecting work on his farm, because Struben had a reputation of being a very good and reliable prospector. And Struben worked for many, many months, and on the 18th of September 1884, he discovered gold on the farm Wilgespreid. Later on, they established what type of gold it was, that it was an intrusion of gold into a quartz rock formation. But the significance of this discovery was that the Struben brothers managed to convince Paul Kruger that the gold here is of so big and so important that Kruger shouldn't be ignoring it anymore. And with some convincing, they convinced Kruger to give them permission to do more prospecting work here. And their discovery was so significant that it attracted the attention of a whole lot more prospectors from all over the world to come and work here. And so they discovered the main reef at Langlaagte.
Property development in Jozi has come a long way since this building, the first skyscraper built in 1929.
The post office building was built in 1897. It's the first public building in the city of Johannesburg. It was built right on top of what used to be Market Square. In other words, Market Square used to stretch from behind the post office building all the way up to behind the library building. And initially the building was 3 stories high, and years later, about 10 years after its construction, they added a 4th floor to the building. And of course, now the tragedy about it is that last year on November the 4th, a fire caught on, and unfortunately we're now stuck with the building in the state that it's in. But the good news is that the city of Johannesburg is committed to restoring the building to its former glory.
Well, the first buildings were in the vicinity of what was at the time the Market Square. And they consisted of large departmental stores. Henwood's was one of them. I can't think of the other one offhand. Studderfits from Cape Town were there.
Architecture in South Africa dates as far back as the earliest residents or citizens of this country. Initially, obviously, the architecture was primarily nomadic because people were constantly moving around. But as the Abantu people moved into the regions, and they were the first settlers in the area, amongst those communities were the earliest architects. And then, of course, following on to 1652, we had the advent of the earliest architectures from Europe being built in the country.
From gold mines, people learned quickly that the next big thing was property investment.
When the earliest European settlers arrived, naturally they needed to create structures that would accommodate their living needs. We learn from documents like Blank that the earliest settlers who arrived in the Cape learned from the people that they found living in South Africa, in the area. So they adopted that mud architecture with the thatch roof cover, and pretty much interpreted thicknesses of walls, thicknesses of thatching, in accordance to how they observed the locals, or as they would say, the natives, creating mud structures for themselves.
With gold, the people that in the end made money out of the gold was the people that owned the land. And also again, people that understood this whole thing of city life, that understood urbanization. So what quickly happened with farmers on whose farm they found the gold, on each of these farms a little village developed. And that village then later on became a suburb, became a settled thing with streets being laid out, houses being built on it, water supply, all of that sorted out on it. And it was the developers that was important in that. And the people that understood that this was going to happen bought the properties up, started zoning it into the suburbs and sold the houses.
Fanuel says the style of architecture has adapted to each era and reflects those who were in power at the given time.
As the settlers became more and more settled in the country, the European settlers, we found that architecture then evolved into a more European architecture. And of course, as time went on, it became more international style architecture. But the progression has been that we have the remnants of Stone Age architecture, Iron Age architecture, and then colonial architecture. And of course, if we get into now political terms, we would then speak about the pre-94 architecture, which was predominantly the Afrikaner architecture, and then post-94 architecture, which is an architecture that attempts really to try and live up to the spirit of our constitution. In much later years, and now if one is to start talking about the post-1994 era, there are architectures that we are witnessing that attempt to speak of the new constitution, about an architecture that's more collective as opposed to separatist.
The growth of the mining industry called for proper accommodation. This would be the first property boom in Johannesburg.
The great boom comes after 1933, when South Africa takes itself off the gold standard, and the price of gold virtually doubles overnight between Christmas and New Year in 1933. I'm sure it's 33, I might be 32, I get a little mixed up. And that attracts a huge amount of money into the Transvaal and into Johannesburg in particular. So much so that in the space of the years 1935 to the end of 1938, 66% of the money that had flowed in the first 40 years flows in again. And that sees Johannesburg being rebuilt. Old buildings pulled down, new buildings put up. That's the next, it is a major building boom.
Where Johannesburg is heading as a city is anyone's guess, but this does not stop people from hoping for the best.
Johannesburg will go where the people that live in it want it to go. Johannesburg will remain the hub of the different cultures that the city, for one, embraces, but I guess also a hub of the different cultures that you find anywhere on the continent. Because of its intrinsic nature of being so accommodating and being such an open city on the whole. Africa, I like that, man.
This city has certainly found a place in the hearts of its people.
It makes me feel special to know that I live in a place on the whole world that is so special.
And after a century of love, wars, riches and poverty, the inhabitants of this city agree on one thing: there is no place like Joburg.
Children now, where do they sleep?